Amen. Good singing.
Come on, preacher, lay it on me.
All right, Billy. If you insist.
No pressure.
There is a beautiful passage in Romans chapter 8 where Paul tells us that we are more than conquerors. More than conquerors. Now, we looked at that word conquer a couple of weeks ago. Do you remember the Greek word that we get that word from? You might be wearing some shoes or a shirt that comes from this word. Nobody? Nike. Thank you. Yes. That means to conquer, to be victorious, to win. And Paul says that we are more than conquerors. And it's fascinating that the word he uses there in Romans chapter 8 is hyper Nike. Hyper Nike. And that means to really overcome, to really beat the enemy, to be victorious in a crazy big way. I wish I had a pair of hyper Nikes to wear. You know, then I could really run fast, right? We'll never know. The problem that we have with Paul calling us hyper Nikes, how many of you feel like a hyper Nike? How many of you feel like you have won the victory, that you have defeated the enemy, that Satan is no match for you, that he shouldn't even bother trying to tempt you, that you have overcome?
Ask me tomorrow.
Huh?
Ask me tomorrow.
Ask to tomorrow? It's not going to be tomorrow either, Lois, because none of us, well, we probably rarely ever feel that way. So, because we don't feel that way, does that make Paul a liar? No. Was he just saying that to sound good? Was he saying that to make us feel good? I watched an interview of a bull rider being interviewed from his hospital bed. Yes. He had ridden a particularly ranked bull and gotten thrown off, and this big old bull had stepped on his head, stepped on his chest, various other body parts, and when he comes to, he's looking up at the doctor, and the doctor looks down at him and says, "Son, you're so lucky. It could have been so much worse."
Yeah.
And the bull rider looks back up at him, and he says slowly, "Doc, I've been lucky before, and it didn't hurt near this bad." And some of you probably feel like that when Paul says you're a hyper Nike, that you are an overcomer, not just an overcomer, but a huge overcomer. You're a hyper Nike. And some of you go, "Yeah, I've been an overcomer before, but it wasn't near this hard." All right? Some of you think, this life is just hard, and overcoming anything is difficult. Being victorious over the devil and his minions is hard to do. And don't worry, because none of us are perfect, yes. But we are going to be completely hyper Nike victorious over Satan when we get to heaven. And then we will be able to look back and we will have complete victory over Satan, over the world, over temptation, and even death. But for now, we still have a battle to fight. The war has been won, but we're still in a battle. In Scripture, overcoming is often equated with enduring. How you can know that you have overcome is because you have overcome continually, that you have endured. And Jesus encouraged those who followed him to endure to the end, he says in Matthew 24. A true disciple of Christ is one who endures by the Holy Spirit through all of those trials that we were talking about earlier, that we're all going to have God says if you just endure those things, that you will be an overcomer. You will be a conqueror. An overcomer clings to Christ no matter how high the cost of that discipleship. No matter what it's going to cost us, we know that we have to hang on to Jesus at all costs. Hebrews 3:14 says, we have come to share in Christ if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the end. In the book of Revelation, Jesus promised great rewards to those who overcome. He says overcomers are promised that they will eat from the tree of life, be unharmed by the second death, eat from the hidden manna, will be given a new name, have authority over nations, be clothed in white garments, be made a permanent pillar in the house of God, sit with Jesus on his throne. But Jesus warned that all of this wasn't going to be easy in this life. He said, but it will be worth it. It will be worth it. In Mark 13:13, he says, you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. So we have the guarantee of Jesus that if we are his, that we will be able to endure to the end, and the rewards will make it all worthwhile. But the question before us this morning, and in this series of messages that we're going through, is, are we really his? How do we know that we truly are his? Are we born of God, as John says? Are we really believers in and followers of Jesus, bound for heaven when we die? We all like to think that we are. Nobody wants to think or wants to admit that they're going to go to hell. And God has said that Jesus said that all we have to do is believe in him. That sounds pretty easy, right? So surely we are all followers of Jesus, heaven bound, right? Jesus said in Matthew 7 that enter through the narrow gate.
Yes.
For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter in through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. That's what Jesus said. What he's saying is that most people who have lived, are living, or are going to live on this earth are not going to make it. They're not going to find heaven. Only a few will find it. And so, how do we know that we are one of the few? Well, that's the question that I'm hoping to have us answer in this series. We're taking 5 tests in this series. 5 weeks, 5 tests to prove to ourselves that we are truly believers. Not proving to anybody else, but proving only to ourselves so that we know, so that you know how it is when Satan comes to you and he says, oh yeah, you're a real believer, and you know that you're not. Or then you become a believer and he says, oh, you didn't do it right. That's not it. You missed it. How can you live that way and still call yourself a believer? You're not a believer. And so we want to be able to prove to ourselves that when Satan comes knocking, you can say, I know that I know that I know that I did what God has told me to do, and so I am undeservedly going to heaven. The first test we took was the faith test. Do we have the faith that it takes to become a believer? The second test was the life test. If we are true believers, then our life will be proven out in our good works. And the third test was the love test. Right? The love test just means, are you loving the unlovely people that God has put in your life? And are you doing all of these things more and more as you get closer to God? Well, today we're going to take the growth test. The growth test is found in 1 John 5:4, and it will show us if we are growing spiritually to the point where we are overcoming sin and temptation and the world and the devil and everything else that we have to overcome. None of us are there yet, but we should be seeing it more and more the more that we look like Jesus, the more that we grow. Okay? The growth test. Turn to 1 John 5:4, way in the back, and let's look at just one verse verse 4, 1 John 5:4, and it simply says, "For everyone born of God overcomes the world." Stop right there. That's enough. John is telling us that if we are true believers, that we will be Nikes. The word is actually Nike in the Greek, but whatever, we know it's Nike, that we're overcomers. That if we are truly His, that we will be overcomers. We will be victorious over the world. But if we're going to be victorious over the world, we need to make sure that we understand what the world is. Because when John says that we're going to overcome the world, he's not talking about the earth, a physical ball. He's saying that we're going to overcome this, not the physical world, but the attitude, or better yet, the spirit of the world, and thus who it is that's in control of this world. If we're going to be overcomers, we need to know who's in control of this world. And the ruler of this world, and I'm going to show you biblically that the ruler of this world, the one who is over this present world system, and the spirit of the world is none other than Satan himself, whom the Apostle Paul refers to as the God of this age. 2 Corinthians 4. Earlier, John talks about the things about this world and the things thereof of this world that we need to overcome. And he says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." As for the lust of the flesh, Paul identifies this as sexual immorality and even things like anger and all those various forms, along with idolatry, sorcery, and anything that deals with ourself. Just that selfishness that we cling to sometimes, that we lust for sometimes. Then John talks about the lust of the eyes. He's talking about those things that we can see and desire, like possessions and power and people and things like that. And then there's the pride of life. Anything that leads to arrogance, boasting, selfishness. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, those are things of the world. Okay? And roughly what John is describing here is nothing less than all those things that are an allurement, an entrapment to our heart. Those are the things that we get caught up in, those concerns. Cindy was talking earlier about the world and how stressful it can be. You've got work, you've got people, you got stuff, you got things, you got places to go and people to, and it's just, it gets to be too much, right? And all those things we get caught up in. And that may include entertainment or amusement, the world of finance and possessions, the world of politics or having power over someone else. And while we can touch and feel some of those things, there is an invisible system behind all of those things that we can't see, but it is there. And it's what Paul describes as the powers of darkness and the spiritual forces of evil. And you know where he says that? Y'all are familiar with Ephesians chapter 6, where he says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against who? Those principalities, those powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, and against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly realms. In Matthew 16, Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble, but I have overcome the world." Let me give you an illustration. When I moved into my house, there was a chain link fence around it, and all through this chain link fence there were briars and thistles and thorns and just a nasty mix match of ugly stuff. And so I tried to get rid of it. And I went and I clipped all of it down at the ground just as low as I could with some those lopper things, you know. And I did the best that I could. And I cut it as close to the ground as possible, and it took a while, but I got most of it, and now it's all there. As my cop buddy says, it's DRT. It's dead right there because it hadn't moved. It's still there, and that's the problem, right? It wasn't all gone. It was still there, and at first, you couldn't tell that I'd done anything. Right? You can imagine the day I cut everything, it doesn't look like I've done anything. And I got most of it, but it was a struggle because it'd been growing in there for so long. That's similar to how we overcome the world. Jesus overcame the world. That's done. And through his death, burial, and resurrection, we no longer have to worry about our salvation if we believe in him. Because sin is dead. Satan is dead. The world in all its foolishness is dead. Even death is dead. The war has been won, but we're still fighting a battle. Because even though it's all dead, the world is still a problem. And it's a problem that we all know all too well. We still get tempted, we still give in to those temptations sometimes, but we ought to be seeing that happen less and less in our lives. So the test is here, this growth test, do you see yourself overcoming more and more? Are you sinning less and less? Maybe you're a believer who you haven't seen much growth in this area in a while. Well, and you're wondering, how can I get back to that healthy growth pattern? Well, let me ask you a question. What are you covering yourself with? What are you covering yourself with? Let me go back to that fence with all those briars. If you're going to go in there, and I wish you would because there's still a bunch there. If you're going to go in there and you're going to clean all that stuff out, all right, it's been cut down at the bottom. It's not connected, and it's all brown. But if you're going to go in there and you're going to get that, how are you going to be dressed? Are you going to show up in shorts and flip-flop? I hope not, because some of that stuff's nasty, hard, and mean, and it will hurt you. You need to be wearing long pants, long sleeves, gloves. Shoot, you need a helmet for some of that stuff, a chainsaw. I mean, it's been going in there for a long time. Well, if you're overcoming the world, you need to be dressed for it. What are you covering yourself with in this life? If you're covering yourself with the things of this world, then don't expect to overcome the world. It's the same theory as a drunk who's trying to give up drinking. He doesn't go to the bar to hang out. You know, if you're trying to overcome the world, you don't hang out with the world. And everything matters. Where you go, what you watch, what you wear, what you eat and drink, the music that you listen to. Oh, the music makes a big difference, what you're listening to. I have another confession. I don't know about you. All my life, I've enjoyed country music. And I know now in the last, I don't know how long, it seemed like country music's kind of pop music, and I don't like it like I used to. I used to like that old good drinking and cheating stuff. You know what I mean? All that George Jones and Merle Haggard. Ooh, that's good stuff right there, isn't it? It's good stuff if you're of the world. It's good stuff if you're not worried about overcoming the world. But I can't listen to that stuff very much. I listen to it every now and then for a few minutes, and then I have to change the station. You know why? Because I can tell my thinking starts to change. When I start having that worldly influence, it doesn't take me long before my thinking gets messed up. And the world will overcome me just by listening to the wrong thing. So now, if you listen to the wrong thing and you watch the wrong stuff and you hang out with the wrong people and you're doing the wrong things of this world that the world doesn't even necessarily say is bad, but they are worldly things, don't be surprised when the god of the wrong stuff, Satan, starts to overcome you.
Come on.
He's prowling around looking for someone he can devour. Why would you lift yourself up on a platter to him by allowing all that stuff into your life? All that stuff that's going to affect you and influence you and just set you up for being overcome when you are the overcomer. Now, this is the fourth in the series of messages, and I hope that you're seeing a similar pattern for all these messages on how to test ourselves if we truly are Christians. There's a couple of things that all these tests have in common. Talked about it a little bit last week, I think. Number one, they're all impossible tests. They're impossible to pass. You can't pass these tests on your own. You can't do it on your own. You have to have God's help. If we are born of God, though, he says, as John says, in fact, that God will give his child the ability, the desire, the strength, the faith, the motive, the passions, everything it takes to do what God has called you to do. That God will give you the ability to do those things. So that's one thing that we see in all of these tests, that we can't do them on our own. The other thing is that these messages are just intended to test you. I'm not really trying to tell you how to love and how to have faith and how to grow. I'm asking, are you seeing these things happening in your life and seeing them manifest themselves more and more in your life as you grow in Christ, as your relationship with God grows? And maybe you don't score 100 on all these tests, and now you're worried because, well, you know, like I have some problems in some of these areas. Don't worry. Nobody makes 100 on these tests until we're face to face with God. But we ought to be able to see these things happening more and more in our lives, okay? If you truly are a believer, these things will happen more and more. Now, if you want to see what true growth and what it looks like and how it allows us to overcome the world, especially through enduring the hardships, I want you to think about young Joseph. You remember the story of Joseph in the Old Testament way back in Genesis, and all those so many great stories. You know how it started with Joseph in his fancy schmancy coat, got thrown into the well, into the pit by his brothers, and he was sold into slavery, and Potiphar bought him. And he did well in slavery. And you remember, even when lonely old Potiphar's wife came and grabbed Joseph by the coat and said, she batted her little eyeballs at him. And she said, hey, Joseph, it's just me and you here today, boy. How about me and you? You remember what Joseph did? Kaya got right on out of there, didn't he? He overcame. And you know what? The thing about Joseph's life, get that out there just right. The thing about his life is that he was continually an overcomer in a life that was difficult. Think about Joseph's life, sold into slavery, and all these things just happened one right after another. But it says that Joseph was able to overcome all of those things. Joseph overcame temptation, despair, loss, loneliness, injustice, and maybe one of the hardest to overcome, he overcame forgiveness, and he even overcame, believe it or not, he was able to overcome prosperity. Catch that? Prosperity. The one thing, though, that is said in Joseph's story over and over and over again, if you read about him from Genesis 37 all the way to the end of the book, all through his life, whether he's in the palace or in the pit, whatever is going on with Joseph, it says, and God was with him. And God was with him. God was with him here, God was with him there, and everywhere God was with him. And because of Joseph's faith in God, he was an overcomer all through his life by God's power. You might even call him a hyper Nike. Right? Does that sound like you? You know, Joseph wasn't perfect. He was a good guy, but he wasn't perfect. And his life was far from perfect, very difficult life. But through God's power, he was able to overcome. That's the test. Just like all the other tests, you can't do it on your own. You can't be a hyper Nike. You can't be a regular Nike. You can't be an under Nike without God's help. And you know that, don't you? Because you've tried it on your own, haven't you? How'd that work out for you? Don't even respond, because we know how that happens. We know what happens when you try it on your own. And God knows that as well. And if you are a believer, if you are a true believer in God, a follower of Jesus, born again Christian, then God gives you the power to overcome what God allows to come into your life. And it may not be pretty, it may not be perfect, but you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. Tell you what, if that sounds like you, I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes, and I just want you to enthusiastically thank God for it. Thank Him for that grace. Thank Him for that power that He gives you, the mercy that He gives, that crazy forgiveness that He gives. And just thank Him for it. But if that doesn't sound like you, if you're not overcoming more and more in this life, I'd love to talk with you right now.